We notified you about the setback violation last month. The excavator has to move.
I understand, but as you can see in this folder, we acquired all the necessary permits.
The demolition crew was already idling their equipment when Denise Halloran stood in my driveway with her arms crossed, smiling like she'd already won. "You had your chance to comply," she said. "Now the county's going to do it for you." Behind her, an excavator sat parked at the curb, its engine ticking over, waiting for a signal. Two HOA board members stood a few feet back, clipboards in hand, trying not to look as uncomfortable as they clearly felt. A single patrol car was parked across the street, the officer leaning against his door, watching everything unfold with the patience of a man who had seen this kind of thing before. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there, holding a folder under one arm, and asked the only question that mattered. "Denise, has anyone actually confirmed the property line?" She laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A confident one. The kind of laugh that comes from someone who has never once been told no and gotten away with it. "The property line isn't the issue," she said. "The barn violates our setback rules. It's coming down today, with or without your permission." I nodded slowly. I'd expected her to say exactly that. What Denise didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent the last 9 days doing something she never once considered doing herself. I had checked. I'm a civil engineer. I've spent almost 15 years reading site plans, verifying elevations, and cross-referencing recorded surveys for a living. When someone tells me a structure violates a boundary, my first instinct isn't to argue. It's to pull the data. And the data told a very different story than the one Denise had been telling the board for the past 2 weeks. The officer straightened up from his car and walked over, unhurried, notepad already in hand. "Ma'am," he said to Denise, "before anything gets torn down, I need to see documentation confirming the violation." Denise's smile didn't waver. "The HOA has documentation. I'd like to see it," he said. Then he turned to me. "And sir, do you have anything you'd like to show me?" I opened the folder. Denise's eyes flicked toward it for just a second, just long enough for me to notice something I hadn't expected to see yet. Uncertainty. But to understand why any of this happened, and why that folder was about to change everything, we have to go back 9 days, to the morning I first noticed someone standing at the edge of my property, taking pictures of a barn that had stood there for 60 years. My name is Grant Osei, and I bought the property on Larkspur Hollow Road almost 2 years ago, mostly because of the barn. It wasn't a working farm anymore, hadn't been for decades, but the original hand-hewn timber frame was still standing, weathered gray, with a roofline that sagged just slightly in a way that somehow made it look more honest than broken. I'm a structural and civil engineer by trade, and I'd spent years walking job sites full of steel and poured concrete. There was something about a building that had survived 60 New England winters on nothing but good joinery that I found genuinely moving. The property sat on just under 2 acres, tucked into a small development called Fallowbrook Ridge, a mix of older farmhouses and newer builds that had gone up around them over the last 20 years. When the newer homes were added, a homeowners association had been formed to manage shared landscaping, a small retention pond, and a private access road. Most of the original rules were reasonable. Mow your lawn. Don't park a boat in your front yard indefinitely. Keep exterior paint colors within an approved range. I didn't love the idea of an HOA, but I understood the reasoning, and I've never been the type to go looking for conflict. I pay my dues on time. I show up to the occasional meeting. I keep my property tidy. If a rule makes sense, I follow it without complaint. The neighborhood itself was quiet, the kind of place where people wave from their porches and mind their own business. Most of my neighbors were retirees or young families, and for the first year and a half, I barely thought about the HOA at all. Then Denise Halloran was elected to the board. I'd met Denise a handful of times before that. Always polite on the surface, always with an edge underneath it. She lived 2 houses down, in one of the newer builds, and she had a habit of describing herself as someone who just wanted things done right. She'd mention, almost as an aside, how she used to work in property management, though she was never specific about where, or for how long, or in what capacity. After she joined the board, the tone of the HOA's communications changed almost immediately. Newsletters that used to be a page long became 3 pages of itemized concerns. Minor cosmetic issues that had gone unmentioned for years suddenly appeared in violation notices. And more than once, I noticed Denise walking the perimeter of my property with her phone raised, photographing the barn from different angles. I told myself it was nothing. New board members often overcorrect in the beginning. I figured she'd settle in eventually. I was wrong about that, but not in the way I expected. The first time she said anything to me directly, she was polite about it, almost disarmingly so. "That barn is quite the character piece," she said one afternoon, standing at the edge of my driveway while I was unloading groceries. "Is it original to the property?" 60+ years, from what the county records say. She smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just want to make sure everything's up to code. You understand?" I said I did. At the time, I genuinely believed that was the end of it. I've learned, since then, that some people mistake a homeowner's calm response for an invitation to keep pushing. Denise was one of those people. I didn't know it yet, but the barn, a structure older than the HOA itself, older than most of the houses on the street, had just become the center of Denise Halloran's next project, and she had no intention of stopping at a friendly question in the driveway. The first official notice arrived 11 days later, tucked into a plain white envelope with the HOA's letterhead. It cited a violation of Section 4.2, Accessory Structure Setback Requirements, claiming my barn sat within 15 feet of the rear property line, when the HOA's covenants required a minimum setback of 30 feet for any accessory structure erected after the community's founding. There was just one problem. The barn predated the HOA's covenants by nearly 4 decades. Grandfather clauses existed for exactly this situation, and I said so, calmly, in a written response I sent back within a few days, along with a copy of the county's building permit history showing the barn's original construction date. I expected that to settle things. Instead, a second notice arrived a week later, this one accusing me of obstructing HOA inspection efforts, a claim I found strange, since no one had ever contacted me to schedule an inspection. When I called the HOA's office to ask about it, the woman on the phone seemed confused too, and admitted she had no record of any inspection request being filed. Around the same time, I started noticing small things. A folding chair had been moved on my porch, just an inch or two, in a way that suggested someone had walked up close enough to examine it. 2 decorative solar lights along my walkway had been knocked over, not broken, just tipped, like someone had brushed past them in a hurry. Once, coming home late from a job site, I saw a shape near the barn's east wall that resolved, when my headlights swept across it, into Denise, phone raised, photographing the structure's foundation in the dark. She didn't run. She just lowered the phone, gave me a small wave, and said, "Just documenting for the board," before walking back toward her own house like nothing unusual had happened. I mentioned it, gently, at the next HOA meeting, not as an accusation, just a comment that I'd noticed board members visiting my property after hours, and that I'd appreciate a heads up beforehand. Denise, sitting near the front, didn't even flinch. "Transparency works both ways, Grant," she said. "If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't matter when someone looks." A few of the other board members exchanged glances, but no one said anything further. I let it go. I've spent my career working alongside people who confuse authority with certainty, and I've learned that the calmest response is usually the most effective one. Arguing with someone who's decided they're right rarely changes their mind. It just gives them more to push against. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Quick question before we continue. If someone on your HOA board started taking photos of your property after dark without telling you, what would you have done in my position? Let me know in the comments, because it's about to get a lot more complicated. The third notice didn't come in an envelope. It came in person, on a Saturday morning, while I was repairing a section of fence near the barn's south side. Denise arrived with another board member, a soft-spoken retiree named Harold, trailing a step behind her like he wasn't entirely sure why he'd been asked to come along. "We need to talk about the barn," Denise said, without preamble. "The board has voted to require its removal within 30 days. I set down the fence post I was holding. "On what basis?" "Setback violation, unpermitted structure, and failure to comply with prior notices." "The setback claim doesn't apply," I said. "It's grandfathered. I sent documentation weeks ago. That documentation is under review." "By who?" She didn't answer that directly. "The board has concerns about safety. That structure is decades old. It's a liability. Has anyone from the board had it inspected by a licensed structural professional?" Denise's jaw tightened slightly. We don't need an engineer to tell us a building is falling apart. I am an engineer, I said, keeping my tone even. And I inspected it myself when I bought the property. The frame is sound. If the HOA has a genuine safety concern, I'm happy to arrange a third-party inspection at my own expense. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not quite doubt, but something close to it. Then it hardened back into certainty. That won't be necessary. The board has already decided. Based on what evidence? Based on the authority granted to us under the covenants. Can I see the specific covenant that allows the board to order demolition of a pre-existing, grandfathered structure without an independent inspection or a hearing? Harold, beside her, shifted his weight and glanced down at his own copy of the covenants, flipping pages slightly. Denise noticed. We don't need to walk through the entire document right now, she said. The point is, the barn is a problem, and the board expects it handled. I'd like that in writing, I said. The specific covenant section, the vote count, and the date of the hearing where this was decided, because as far as I know, I was never notified of a hearing. You'll get what you need to get. I need that before I can respond appropriately, I said. Without documentation, I can't in good conscience take any action, and frankly, neither should the board. Denise's expression cooled further. You're welcome to challenge it, but I'd think carefully before you do. The board doesn't take kindly to homeowners who make things difficult. I'm not trying to make anything difficult, I said. I'm trying to understand the process. If the process is legitimate, I'll follow it. If it isn't, I think we both know that's a problem bigger than one barn. She didn't respond to that. She simply turned, told Harold they were done here, and walked back toward the street. I stood there for a moment, looking at the barn's weathered timber frame, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to recognition. Denise wasn't operating from a rulebook. She was operating from momentum. The assumption that if she pushed hard enough and confidently enough, most people would simply comply rather than push back. She had no idea that pushing back was, professionally speaking, exactly what I was built for. Over the following 2 weeks, the pressure increased steadily. A formal violation letter arrived, citing 3 separate covenant sections, only one of which actually existed in the version of the covenants I'd been given when I purchased the property. A fine notice followed, $150 for failure to comply with board directive, despite the fact that no legitimate directive had ever been properly documented or delivered to me in writing. Then came the towing notice. My work truck, parked in my own driveway, was tagged with a warning sticker claiming it violated a commercial vehicle restriction, even though the covenants only restricted vehicles parked on the shared access road, not private driveways. I didn't argue with any of it out loud. Instead, I did what I do at the start of every project that involves a dispute over facts. I built a file. I requested a certified copy of the HOA's governing covenants directly from the property management company that technically oversaw the association's records, not the version Denise had been citing, but the one legally recorded with the county. I pulled the original county survey for my property, along with the historical building permit for the barn, dated decades before the HOA's formation. I requested, in writing, the minutes from any board meeting where a vote on the barn had allegedly taken place. That last request went unanswered for 9 days. When the minutes finally arrived, they were oddly sparse. A single paragraph noting that the board discussed concerns regarding an accessory structure, with no vote tally, no attendance record, and no mention of any homeowner being formally notified. I compared it against the association's own bylaws, which required a minimum of a 72-hour notice to any homeowner before a vote directly affecting their property could be finalized. No such notice existed in my mailbox, my email, or my file of certified mail. I didn't confront Denise with any of this yet. I've learned, in my line of work, that presenting incomplete evidence too early only gives the other side time to explain it away. You gather everything first. You verify it against the original source. And you wait until the picture is complete enough that there's no room left to argue with it. So I kept collecting. Photographs of the barn's foundation, dated and time-stamped, showing no structural movement over 18 months. A written statement from the county assessor's office confirming the barn's original permit date. A comparison chart lining up the covenant sections Denise had cited against the actual recorded document. Meanwhile, the fines kept arriving. 2 more notices. A threat of a lien if the barn wasn't removed within the stated deadline. I paid nothing, contested nothing publicly, and said very little. I just kept building the file. At this point, I want to ask you something. When someone cites rules that don't actually exist, ignores their own bylaws, and skips the notice requirements meant to protect homeowners, does that sound like someone enforcing rules, or someone enjoying the feeling of having power over another person? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Then, almost as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. No new notices arrived. No fines. No visits to the property. For almost 10 days, the mailbox held nothing but the usual junk mail and the occasional bill. I ran into Harold at the mailbox one afternoon, and he mentioned, a little sheepishly, that the board had tabled the barn discussion for now, pending further review. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. I assumed, cautiously, that someone on the board had finally taken a closer look at the covenants and realized the demolition order had never been on solid ground to begin with. For the first time in weeks, I let myself relax a little. I finished the fence repair. I spent a Saturday clearing brush near the barn's foundation, the kind of quiet, unremarkable work that makes a property feel like yours again. I even considered, briefly, that Denise had simply moved on to a different project, the way people sometimes do when the ground shifts out from under their certainty. I was wrong. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, sharp and official. I opened the door to find a code enforcement officer from the county, along with a uniformed police officer standing a respectful distance behind him. Parked at the curb was a flatbed carrying a small excavator, and beyond that, Denise Halloran's car, with Denise already out and standing near the mailbox, arms crossed. "Mr. Osei," the code enforcement officer said, "we received a complaint alleging an unpermitted structure on your property, along with a request for expedited removal, citing safety concerns." "Filed by who?" He checked his clipboard. "The HOA board, through Ms. Halloran." I glanced toward Denise. She didn't look away. "I was told the board tabled this discussion," I said. "The board can revisit items," Denise said smoothly. "We revisited it. The safety concern was serious enough that we felt the county should be involved directly, rather than waiting on a homeowner to act voluntarily." The police officer, a calm, unhurried man named Officer Reyes, stepped forward slightly. "Before anyone moves equipment," he said, "I want to make sure we're working from confirmed information. Ma'am, do you have documentation supporting the safety claim?" "The structure is decades old and structurally compromised," Denise said. "That's obvious just from looking at it." "Has it been formally inspected by a licensed professional?" the code enforcement officer asked. There was a brief pause. "The board's assessment. I mean a licensed structural inspection," he clarified. "Because if this is being handled as an emergency safety removal, we need documentation to support that classification. Otherwise, this needs to go through the normal permitting and appeal process, which would include written notice to the property owner and a chance to respond." Denise's confidence didn't waver, at least not visibly. "The homeowner has been notified multiple times." "I'd like to see those notices," Officer Reyes said, notepad already out. "And sir," he added, turning to me, "do you have anything you'd like to add?" "I do," I said. "I have quite a bit, actually." I asked for a few minutes, went inside, and returned with the folder I'd been building for weeks. Copies of the certified covenants, the county's building permit records, the sparse and improperly noticed board minutes, and the engineering assessment I'd had completed independently just to remove any doubt. Officer Reyes took the folder and began reviewing it methodically, unhurried, cross-referencing it with the notes Denise had been giving him. The code enforcement officer leaned in beside him, and I watched both of their expressions shift slightly as they moved page by page. Denise, watching this unfold, tried once more. "Regardless of paperwork technicalities," she said, "the barn is an eyesore that doesn't belong in a community like ours." "Ma'am," the code enforcement officer said, not unkindly, "an eyesore isn't a safety hazard, and it isn't something the county has any authority to order demolished. If this is a covenant dispute, that's a civil matter between the homeowner and the HOA, not something we can act on with equipment." For the first time since I'd known her, Denise didn't have an immediate response. "Before we go further, have you ever seen authorities called out over something this minor, where the real issue clearly had nothing to do with safety at all?" I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Officer Reyes continued working through the folder, and with each page, the tone at the curb shifted a little further. The first document he lingered on was the county's original permit record, confirming the barn had been constructed decades before the HOA's founding, which meant, under the association's own recorded covenants, it was unambiguously grandfathered from the setback requirement Denise had cited from the very beginning. This directly contradicts the primary violation listed in the complaint, he said, glancing at the code enforcement officer. Denise shifted her weight. The board's legal interpretation differs. Whose legal interpretation? Officer Reyes asked. Is there an attorney's opinion in the file? There wasn't. Denise didn't answer. The second document was the independent structural assessment, completed the week prior by a licensed engineer I'd hired specifically to remove any ambiguity. It confirmed the barn's frame, foundation, and roof structure were all sound, with no signs of the deterioration Denise had described in her complaint. This inspection is dated 5 days ago, the code enforcement officer noted. Was the board aware of it? I wasn't given the opportunity to review it, Denise said. You were emailed a copy the day it was completed, I said quietly, and produced the delivery confirmation. The third document was the comparison chart, the covenant sections Denise had cited in her official notices, laid side by side with the actual recorded text of those sections. 2 of the 3 didn't exist in the recorded version at all. The third had been altered slightly in wording, changing "may recommend removal following a hearing" into what Denise's version described as "shall require immediate removal." Officer Reyes read it twice. Ma'am, he said, can you explain the discrepancy between the covenant language in the official complaint and the covenant language on file with the county recorder? I would have to check my source document, Denise said. I'd like to see that source document, he replied. She didn't produce one. The final piece was the meeting minutes, thin, vague, and missing the notice requirement altogether. Officer Reyes set it beside the HOA's own bylaws, which I had highlighted at the relevant clause requiring 72 hours written notice before any vote affecting a specific homeowner's property. There's no notice in here, he said. Was Mr. Osei formally notified of this vote, in writing, at least 3 days beforehand? Denise's response came slower this time. I believe verbal notice was given. Was it? Officer Reyes asked me directly. No, I said. The only communications I received were the violation notices themselves, after the fact. The code enforcement officer closed his own notepad. At this point, I don't have grounds to authorize any removal. This looks like an internal HOA procedural dispute, not a county safety matter. Denise's composure, which had held through nearly every exchange so far, finally began to slip. This is ridiculous, she said. The board voted. The structure is a problem. Someone has to actually enforce something around here. Ma'am, Officer Reyes said evenly. Enforcement has to be based on accurate information. Right now, most of what's in this complaint doesn't match the recorded documentation. Something in the air at the curb had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The excavator operator, who had been leaning against his vehicle waiting for instructions, glanced toward the code enforcement officer, then back at his equipment, clearly sensing the job wasn't happening today. Harold, who had arrived a few minutes earlier and stood quietly near the mailbox through most of the exchange, finally spoke up. Denise, he said, did the board actually approve sending the county out here? I don't remember voting on that. I acted on the board's behalf, Denise said. Someone had to move things forward. You filed a complaint with the county as if it was an official board action, Harold said slowly, without a vote. Denise didn't answer him directly. Officer Reyes handed the folder back to me. I'd recommend keeping copies of everything you gave us today. If the HOA continues pursuing this without proper documentation, this looks like something that would need to go through mediation or civil court, not county enforcement. Understood, I said. I have no interest in dragging this out longer than necessary. I just want accurate information used, and my property left alone unless there's an actual, documented reason to be here. The code enforcement officer nodded. That's a reasonable position. For what it's worth, from what I've reviewed today, I don't see a valid basis for a removal order. Denise stood there for a long moment, arms still crossed, but the certainty that had carried her through every prior conversation had visibly drained out of her posture. She looked, for the first time since I'd met her, like someone who had run out of a script she'd been relying on for weeks. "This isn't over," she said, though it came out quieter than she probably intended. "It doesn't need to be adversarial," I said. "If the board has a legitimate concern, I'm happy to work through it properly, with actual documentation and an actual vote, an actual notice. That's all I've been asking for." She didn't respond. She walked back toward her car without another word, and Harold lingered a moment longer, glancing at me with something that looked like quiet embarrassment. "I didn't realize how far this had gone," he said. "I'm sorry, Grant. You don't owe me an apology," I said. "But the board might want to take a closer look at how decisions are being made before someone else ends up in this position." He nodded slowly and left without saying anything more. The formal resolution came about 2 weeks later, in the form of a letter from the HOA's property management company, not from Denise, but from the association's newly retained legal counsel, who had apparently been brought in after Harold raised concerns at the next board meeting. The letter confirmed 3 things. First, that the barn was formally recognized as a grandfathered structure, fully exempt from the setback requirements cited in the original complaint. Second, that all outstanding fines related to the barn and the mislabeled commercial vehicle violation were being withdrawn, with a formal notation removed from my HOA file. Third, that the board would be implementing a new internal policy requiring any homeowner-specific enforcement action to be approved by a documented vote, with proper written notice, before any formal complaint could be filed with outside authorities. Denise was not named directly in the letter, but at the following open board meeting, which I attended out of curiosity more than necessity, it became clear that her role in initiating the county complaint without board approval had raised serious concerns among the other members. She wasn't removed from the board. She wasn't publicly humiliated. But her ability to act unilaterally on behalf of the HOA had been formally curtailed, and several homeowners who had quietly dealt with similar pressure from her over the past year finally spoke up during the meeting's public comment period. I didn't say much myself. I didn't need to. The documentation had already said everything that needed to be said. Here's a question worth sitting with. Do you think Denise ever expected things to end this way? Back when she was standing in that driveway, certain the bulldozers were about to prove her right? In the months that followed, the neighborhood settled back into the quiet rhythm it had before Denise joined the board. She kept her distance after that. We'd still occasionally cross paths at the mailbox or during community cleanup days, and the interactions were polite, if noticeably brief. I never felt the need to bring up what had happened. Some situations resolved themselves simply by no longer needing to be discussed. The HOA, to its credit, followed through on its new procedural policy. A few months later, when a different homeowner had a minor landscaping dispute with the board, I noticed the process moved exactly the way it should have from the start. Written notice, a scheduled hearing, documentation reviewed calmly by both sides. The barn is still standing. I finished restoring the section of fence near its foundation not long after everything settled, and some evenings I'll walk out just to look at it. 60-some years of quiet endurance, still standing long after the argument about whether it deserved to. I never wanted to win an argument. I just wanted my property and the facts about it respected. Looking back on everything that happened on Larkspur Hollow Road, a few things stand out to me more than the conflict itself. Staying calm wasn't just a personality trait, it was strategy. The moment you match someone else's escalation, you lose the clarity needed to actually solve the problem. Documenting everything, from day one, mattered more than any single conversation ever could. And respecting property boundaries, both the physical kind and the procedural kind, isn't optional just because someone with a clipboard insists otherwise. At the end of the day, facts held up. Authority, when it's working correctly, doesn't take sides, it verifies. And that's exactly what happened here. If you enjoyed this story, I'd really appreciate a like. And if you want more real-world HOA and neighbor stories like this one, consider subscribing. I share these regularly. Feel free to share this with anyone who's ever dealt with an HOA that forgot where its authority actually ends. And next time, we're heading to a quiet lakeside community, where a property line dispute over a private dock is about to involve a licensed surveyor, a set of records nobody expected to still exist, and a neighbor who's about to learn exactly how permanent a recorded easement really is. Have you ever dealt with an HOA or a neighbor who tried to control something on your own property? Share your experience in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of the best stories on this channel started exactly there.